Hello. Welcome to everything you ever wanted to know about sandblasting, but were afraid to ask. This particular video is going to be on sandblasting equipment and setup. I will do another which will demonstrate actual sandblasting. This is a 100% homemade production. The image here shows a piece of red on clear and a piece of blue on clear flash glass with simple sandblasting. In this case, some areas have been sandblasted all the way through to the clear layer, which appears as white areas, and then lightly sandblasted in the areas that have slightly cloudy tones. In another demo, I will go into more, into this, so don't worry if you don't get it right away. Uh-oh, here comes the cat. A sandblaster is a brutish and crude piece of equipment. I personally do not enjoy sandblasting. It's also very loud. However, it is certainly a means to an end. In my work, sandblasting is done almost 100% in order to prepare the surface for other processes such as painting or engraving. I usually don't use the sandblaster as a tool to create airbrush effects or to make detailed imagery. Is that possible? Sure. It's just not easy and it's not my preferred way. A sandblaster consists of a few parts, mainly an air compressor, a sandblast cabinet, and a dust collection system, plus a pressure gauge and a water trap. Also, you will need some blast media. There are two types of sandblasting systems, a siphon feed, which is what I use, and a pressure pot. The siphon feed here is on the left, and as you can see, the siphon is the inverted pyramid at the bottom. I'll point to it with my mouse. That thing is the siphon. This is a pressure pot system. A pressure pot is appropriate when you need massive amounts of pressure. For example, if you are deeply carving into thick three-dimensional objects. It's not necessary for stained glass, and you might even blow holes in it by mistake. This is my air compressor on the right, and on the left is the detail of those labels that are stuck to it. It's set up in my basement, and that reminds me that in terms of DIY and home sandblasting and stained glass setups, this is by far the most expensive aspect of sandblasting, is where to put the air compressor. Because basically, if you don't have a nice industrial space, you better own your home, because this thing is heavy. I had this sucker moved on 2 occasions, and I hope to never do that again. Also, it has to be wired into your electrical system. So if you are actually going to buy a house, make sure that it has enough power to run your sandblaster. It's not that much, but it's a little more than like your washer and dryer. The top part of the compressor are these two things here. The bottom part, which I am not showing, is the tank where all the compressed air is stored. My tank contains 100 gallons. On the left here, you have a 2-phase pump, and on the right is a 5-horsepower motor. You can go a little less with these things, like a 3-horsepower motor, or a smaller tank. However, the smaller the tank, the more often it will have to fill up, and that puts a strain on the pump and the motor. And if the pump and the motor are less powerful, they will have to work harder, so you get the point. I would say a 5-horsepower motor, a 2-phase pump, and a 100-gallon tank are optimal. The compressor comes with a gauge that tells you how much air is in the tank. It also has a release lever to let the air flow into the pipes or hoses that lead to the sandblast cabinet. On the left, the lever is closed. See, that's closed. On the right, it is open. Levers like this are almost always open when they are parallel with the pipe. So in this formation here. My compressor is an upright model. There is a drain cock on the bottom of the tank, but opening it for routine drainage, which is part of the maintenance routine, meant that I had to lie down on my stomach on the dirty basement floor with a vice grip struggling to unscrew this thing by reaching under the tank where I can't see what I'm doing. So after years of doing that, I finally hired someone to trick out the machine with an extension and a lever valve. So now it's easy peasy to drain the tank. And it wasn't even that expensive. Where to buy air compressors? You can get air compressors from places like Home Depot and Lowe's. And here are 3 links to try places to look on the web. These places are tool things for contractors and people who are very interested in doing their own work, and they're excellent resources. The first is McMaster.com, the second is Granger.com, and the third is TP Tools. I call it Tip Tools, but there's no I in tip. TPTools.com. And that's easy to remember. Toilet paper tools. Anyway, these are great resources for all kinds of tools and equipment for industrial purposes. Next, you will need to consider the Sandblast cabinet. The Sandblast cabinet is a box that looks like a baby incubator with a window and gloves that reach inside. That's mine on the left, which is the same thing as the one on the right, but the one on the right is a catalog image, not actually mine. My cabinet is made by a company called Sandblast. As you probably know, scat is a word that means animal feces, particularly cat poo. And obviously the Sandblast company knew this because they put a cat in the logo. And there's a cat. I have no explanation for that personal decision of the Sandblast company. Maybe they thought it was a good idea at the time. However, it makes me think about blasting cat poo all over. I will say that as a cabinet goes, this one is extremely functional and it was relatively inexpensive, so I do recommend it. Inside the cabinet is a wire grate shelf, which allows the Sandblast grit to fall into the siphon feed. There is a gun to spray the sand and a light so that you can see what you're doing, which is not pictured in this image. Now, there are 2 main types of gun. One has a hand trigger and the other utilizes a foot pedal. I highly recommend the foot pedal as you can end up sandblasting for a while, and the hand trigger really tires your hand out fairly quickly. Now, for reasons I can't fathom, most sandblast cabinets seem to be designed for people over 6 feet tall. For this reason, you may need something to stand on, like a small wooden platform. I guess the person who designed the very first cabinet was extremely tall, and then no one ever did anything about the design after that. Go figure. The little whisk broom in the picture is to sweep the sand away from the cabinet door before I open it to get the sandblasted glass out, on account of the fact that it tends to build up near the door and then it falls all over the floor. This is what the foot pedal looks like. And behind the foot pedal, you see there is a bucket and a screen over the bucket. That is underneath the siphon feed of the cabinet. And the reason for that is that there's a spring-loaded door on the bottom of the siphon feed, and that's how you get rid of the old abrasive when you want to change it. The bucket is so that it doesn't go all over the floor, obviously, and the screen is to sift out any debris like glass or sandblast resist masking or just junk that got into the sandblaster somehow. So that's helpful to clean the grit, because you can reuse it, and sometimes you want to change from different grit sizes. Finally, in terms of the cabinet, you will need to be somewhere near an electrical outlet so that you can plug in the light and the dust collector. So where do you get Sandblast cabinets? Glasstar sells full setups that include the cabinet and sometimes the dust collector and a few accessories. This one here costs $2,508, which sounds, it says it's the affordable cabinet, but I think you can get a cheaper one somewhere else. So I would Google them and see if you can find a deal. The air compressor can be attached to the cabinet in a number of ways. You can use rubber or plastic hoses. If you use hoses, make sure that they can withstand the pressure, especially at the joints where they connect. So you'd be using those little ring connectors, and they have to be real tight. Otherwise, the pressure from the air compressor will pop them off. Or if you want to get fancy, you can use soldered copper piping, which is preferred. Mine is done. This is my system here, and you can see the copper pipes on the right. I traded a transom window for this work to be done, and boy, am I happy I did. It helps it run much smoother. In this image, you see two more things. The first is a pressure gauge, which allows your sandblaster to sandblast at different PSI. PSI means pounds per square inch. I personally sandblast between 80 and 100 PSI always, never lighter and never greater. Greater, you put stress on the system. Lighter, it takes forever. The thing on the right, this thing here, is a water trap. And mine does not work well, so there's that. As for setting up all of this stuff, I went to a school where I was taught that you had to learn how to do this stuff all by yourself, or you were a lousy human being who didn't deserve to live. And I believed that. So my very first sandblaster, I built the cabinet myself out of scrap wood, dish gloves, and car mats. This thing was so bad. It barely worked. And I attached it myself to a very tiny air compressor, and I learned quickly that all of this was futile. It took me a while to admit my limitations and give up my dream of being a fully independent human being, and ultimately I hired a car mechanic to set this up for me. Car mechanics know how to do this stuff. And this ultimately saved me tons of time and money, because doing it myself was actually much more costly than having some person who knows what they're doing do it. So I do recommend that. Finally, you will need a dust collector. This is basically a vacuum that sucks the dust out of the cabinet. Without one, the dust quickly makes thick clouds and you will not be able to see what you're doing. Plus, it goes out into the atmosphere of wherever you have set up your basement, and it's nasty. So you definitely have to have a dust collector. This dust collector, I think, came with the Sandblast cabinet. They're not that expensive. And in terms of maintenance, you have to dump out the dust every now and then. And I will tell you a story. I put all this, about 50 pounds of waste Sandblast dust out on the curb to be collected by the trash men. And yes, someone stole it. It weighed a ton. They had to haul that somewhere. All right. So apropos of the dust getting into the atmosphere, lots of dust will get into the atmosphere anyway. So that leads me to this. Do not even consider for a single second sandblasting without the proper safety equipment for your lungs. This is a respirator. You cannot use a paper mask. You must use a proper respirator, and you must use the proper dust filter cartridges. That is easy to Google, and they are readily available. So there's no excuse, and they're not that expensive, and they last a while. Otherwise, you are risking silicosis and death from sandblasting. Do I make myself perfectly clear here? There are other diseases you can get. There's one called Shaver's disease from the aluminum oxide. Silicosis is from the glass particles. When workers inhale the crystalline silica used in abrasive blasting, the lung tissue reacts by developing fibrotic nodules and scarring around the trapped silica particles. Basically, you will be at higher risk of developing active tuberculosis and black lung, just like a coal miner. That is not desired. So please wear your respirator, wear it every single time, no matter what. Lastly, you will need sandblast media, also known as grit or sand. I use either 80 or 120 alumina oxide grit. Grit is sized by the higher the number, the finer the grit. So 80 grit is pretty rough. Some people like to use 220 grit for stained glass, but it's very fine and it will be slower. However, it has a very nice, smooth look to it. I will tell you, once when I was teaching at Pilchuck, I got the nickname 20 grit. That's pretty rough. I'm not sure if I should be insulted or not, but anyway. The sandblasted glass will get a texture from the sandblasting process from the grit. So the 80 grit will have a little rougher texture on it than the 120, which will be rougher still from the 220. Sandblasting basically frosts the glass and makes the glass less transparent. Many students and people have asked me, is there a way to get the smooth, pristine, and clarity back again? And the answer is yes and no. One way is to fire polish, meaning that when you're done doing everything you want to your piece of glass, you can put it in a kiln and bring it up to about 1300 degrees Fahrenheit, and that will melt some of the texture down. It won't look the way it did when you first started working with the glass, but it will make it transparent again. You can also hand polish, which I will be talking about in another demonstration on another day, and then fire polish, and that will make it even clearer, but that's quite difficult and not really all that necessary. As for the grit itself, I get mine from a company called Salem Distributors. It comes in 50-pound buckets. So remember, stained glass artists, it pays to stay fit. And that, my friends, is the end of the stained glass equipment demo. Thank you for listening.